I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Welcome back to another episode of the Way Forward podcast. As always, I'm your host, Bryce Futch, here with the Spencer Amaral.
Hey, Bryce.
And today we're going to be talking about rights and what do rights mean and how do they function in life and society, and what do we actually have the right to do? Is freedom the ability to do what we want, or is it the responsibility to do what we ought? We're going to dive into it. So this is going to be fun. Stick with us. There'll be a lot of nuance here, and we'll try not to make it too nerdy. But that's kind of that's kind of the danger with this stuff. So Spencer, why don't you start off by giving us kind of an overview of our natural rights?
Well, when we're talking about natural rights as Americans, we all have, the words of the Declaration of Independence that jump to our minds, and we automatically have a sense of, where the founding fathers are coming from, where they're sticking up for themselves against a king that they feel is overstepping, against a parliament that's violating English constitutional law. And they're saying, look, we have certain things that we're entitled to. We have certain rights as Englishmen, as subjects of the crown. But even more fundamentally than that, we have certain rights under heaven that we can appeal to if we feel like the powers that be are not serving us very well. And so that's the argument as they laid out in the Declaration of Independence. We kind of build on that with the Constitution, trying to create an order of government that reflects that idea and protects those rights that the founding fathers sense to be natural and inalienable. Now, their sense of the word nature here is important. They're speaking in reference to something that's built into nature itself, built into the fabric of reality, right? Something that's a part of us as people, something that cannot be taken away, which is literally the sense of inalienable rights. These are things that you can't take
Mm-hmm.
away from a person. All that you can try to do is infringe upon them, and to do so is a moral crime, right? So that's the way that the founding fathers talk about it. But you can see this drift in American history up to our own time, where it's really become a slippery slope of what are we talking about when we speak about rights, and what are we really entitled to? And what's really confounded the conversation is that at the same time that we are getting very fast and loose with this sense of what we're entitled to, it seems like we have constantly expanding definitions
Mm-hmm.
of that. But at the same time, we've moved away from the old foundation for what the founding fathers were talking about. In the Declaration, they anchor it in the Creator. All of the rights that we have are endowed to us by our Creator. The more post-Christian America becomes, however, we're no longer falling back on that foundation of rights coming from a divine being, a supernatural source, woven into our creation as people made in the image of God. And if we move away from that foundation, then what are we talking about when we're talking about rights and entitlements? Now, we have touched on this in previous conversations
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, from a worldview perspective, how silly the conversation quickly becomes. But today, I think it's good for us to look at the state of the current American conversation about rights, especially this difference that you'll hear some people pick up on between negative liberties, positive liberties, a negative approach to rights, a positive approach to rights, which in short is just a reference to,
Mm-hmm.
is there some way to actually draw a lasso around what we mean by rights and freedoms and entitlements? And the closest thing to a bright line that limits this is a negative conception of freedom where, I am free to not be imposed upon, right? I'm free to not be
Mm-hmm.
interfered with by the state or by my neighbor. And then there's the positive view of liberty, which quickly becomes very expansive. And it basically follows the idea that I have a natural claim, I am naturally entitled to whatever is required for me to live a free life, right? And then again, what do you mean by free? Typically, that means
Mm-hmm.
a happy, fulfilled, fully human life. And the things that I lack that are required for that kind of life I have a natural claim to. So those would be the differences between positive and negative liberty. And in our time, Bryce, I think so many people feel like the only meaningful way to have this conversation is in the positive sense because that's where the state is today. I mean, how many years ago were conservatives still trying to argue for small government, keep the government small, uh, fight against entitlements, fight against even Social Security, fight against all of these things that
Hmm.
would just be forms of government. Uh, True provision for my life, but that comes at the cost of government taxing me more heavily and intruding in my life more on the front end. And so conservatives would push back against that. Progressives would argue for more government action in order to provide the things that are required for a free human existence. And this is a big part of FDR's approach in the New Deal. But in recent times, it seems like everyone's kind of jumped on the wagon and said, hey, government's in the business of looking out for its people, providing stuff, and we want our people to be happy. We want people to have what they need. So now we're just figuring out who should the government be favoring? Who should be the winners and who should be the losers that government's gonna jump in with and start actively functioning as benefactor to.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And I don't want to dominate. So
No, that's fine. I felt like I was going to cut you off there.
so if that's where the conversation has moved to today, and I think the populism that is kind of swept up on the political right has definitely accentuated this in certain ways. Now, of course, to be fair, Bryce, I you could also point out that even when conservatives today and populists talk about protecting American workers, protecting American industry, protecting American families, they generally fall back on the idea of tax cuts, right? It's not so much a subsidy as a we're going to stop taking money from you. We're going to take a little
Right,
less
right,
money
right.
from you, and you should be very thankful. Uh, whereas on the political left, it's still the dominant idea is this sense that you have an entitlement to more things than you have access to through your own free initiative, and the government is the only means of providing you with the things that you need. A lot of this debate did, this was the focal point of the Depression era, and for FDR
Hmm.
and the New Deal, he argued very strongly and very effectively that you know you tell people that they're free, but that doesn't mean a whole lot if they're starving to death and they don't have what they need to actually survive. And to be fair, that's true. That's not the kind
Yeah.
of
And
existence
that
anyone
was
would want.
right. And that was kind of the basis for Norman Rockwell's The Four Freedoms, right? Was it Four Freedoms? Five Freedoms?
I
The
want to say
series of paintings
four.
he did. Yeah, I think it was four. Which are, uniquely American
Yeah,
and excellent. Freedom, it was freedom of speech, freedom from want,
freedom from
freedom of
fear.
religion, freedom from fear.
So that freedom from want and freedom from fear is a little more of the expansive view of people are entitled to
Hmm.
not be in want, entitled to not be in fear in their own homes. And of
Yeah.
course, we would rather live a fear-free life and a life of plenty. But the
Hmm.
minute you start talking about these things through the lens of entitlement, it just necessitates a different conversation about what the government needs to do in order to provide the things
Right.
that I'm entitled to.
Yeah, I heard the number recently, and I'm trying to remember what it was off the top of my head. I think it's 60. I think it's at least 60%. I'm pretty sure it's right at 60% of our federal budget every year is entitlement spending. Uh, and these are not bad things, but historically, these are not things that have been the purview of the government, right? A lot of the entitlement and the welfare stuff should be, and we've talked about this at length, should be the responsibility of the church and is the responsibility of the church. But the government has assumed a lot of that responsibility because of this view that, basically government is the new religion, right? And government wants us to rely on them more because that keeps them in power. And I think it starts from a good place of being compassionate, right? And saying the government is big. We have a big bankroll. We can do a lot of good. Let's help a lot of people. But it very quickly goes off the rails, and it's really harmful for a large portion of society because it removes the necessity of work. It takes away the dignity of work. And anytime you, like you said a minute ago, anytime you have the idea that you're entitled to something like the freedom from want, right? That means you're entitled to food. Well, if you're entitled to food, then you're entitled to that farmer's labor and you're entitled to that farmer's work. I don't think Rockwell meant it in that way. I think the way he meant, and maybe I'm too gracious to him, but I think the American idea of that is not a,
Rockwell is an
you know,
American treasure and a hero and a
he
saint.
is,
So
yes, and we are not going to degrade him today. So we're going to give him the greatest
it's
benefit of
not
the
all what he
doubt.
meant. Yeah, I know. I
I
love
mean,
his
who
stuff
knows?
so much.
If you ask Glenn Beck, maybe he was a Fabian socialist. That's probably deep back in Rockwell's closet somewhere. But anyway, Rockwell, freedom from want, we are we're a we're the breadbasket of the world, right? There's no reason a child should be hungry in the United States today. And really, what that comes down to is access. So that to organizations like the church, like the local community welfare is really where this needs to be taking place. So anyway, I don't think it's meant of, hey, give me this that you created and you labored for, but rather as a society, we need to be focused on each other and not just on our own greed and selfish welfare, if that makes sense, prideful welfare.
Well, to that point, that's where that's where communism gets really messy, right? Because
Hmm.
Marx could see that problem coming,
Right.
of the problem of greed and self gratification. And what's his antidote to it? Well, don't take,
It's
an extravagant amount for yourself. In fact, from each, according to his ability, and to each, according to his
right.
need.
Sure, and that's the way he wrote it in the book. But the way it plays out is it's greed at the top. It's greed within the government, right? The government owns everything. The government controls everything.
Oh, it's horrible
You're just
because you end
yeah,
up,
you're replacing the individual with the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is now entitled to it all.
yeah, because the minute you create a system that doesn't incentivize people to labor as much as you need
Right.
them to supply for all of the entitlements that you've, obligated
Yeah.
yourself to provide, then you have to force people to produce, and rip the fruit of their labor away from them, which is what the Soviet
Right.
Union was doing to Ukrainian farmers, right?
Yep.
And killing people in the name of, serving the common
Yeah.
man, in the name of providing people with their basic entitlements. And so it
Right.
becomes brutally horrific and messy, to say the least, the minute government starts stepping in with a gun to provide all of the things
Hmm.
that it has told its people they're entitled to. So when I say
Yeah.
the word entitlement, there's a very specific word, or a scene that always comes to my mind from House of Cards.
Hmm.
And when Kevin Spacey, he's running for president, I forgot at what point in the show this was, but there's a famous part of the show where he's giving this speech and he's kind of turning in a darker direction with his politics. And he
Yeah.
just tells people, like, you are entitled to nothing. And it almost feels
Yep.
like he's ripping away, the rug from under their feet, and his nice guy persona is just
Hmm.
gone, and he's turning into this villain kind of character. But that idea of people being entitled to nothing, that it has a shock effect on the American psyche, because our politicians tell us
Hmm.
all day long about all the things that we're entitled to. But the thing that was
Right.
revealed in the show is the minute he tells people you are entitled to nothing, what do they fall back on? How do you actually fight back against that idea? How do you establish what you are exactly entitled to? What are your rights? What are they founded on? And
Hmm.
that brings us full circle with the American founders. For them, the only logical argument is based on the premise that This isn't just me speaking out of selfishness and greed and desire. This is me objectively calling a spade and acknowledging the fact that people have an innate intrinsic worth and dignity because they're made in the image of God, and that counts for something. And that's a factor that
Hmm.
has to be taken into account by kings and rulers and bureaucrats and Bolshevik czars. Um, and when we
Absolutely.
fail to take that into consideration, you see the powers that be run wild and people suffer. But when you go beyond that and it becomes this Roman circus cycle where
Hmm.
you just give the people what they want and you throw candy and bread and games at
Right.
them day in and day out until the society's corrupted on the other end of things
Hmm.
by the interference of the state. So the American experiment, and this is where I'll sound super, red, white, and blue. I think the beauty of the American experiment, the American project, is being able to navigate the middle ground between those two ditches of an
Hmm.
inflated state on the one end that deprives the people of their rights, and the state becomes vicious,
Yeah.
seeking its own good over the good of the people. Versus, on the other end, it could be a state that gives the people everything that they ever dreamed of, but again, to the detriment of the people and the society as a
Hmm.
whole, to the corruption of the whole, which is what you see in Rome. If we're not aware of both of those extremes being horrifically evil and terrible and ending
Right.
spectacularly badly, you don't have a shot at maintaining what the founding fathers saw as a very clear and straight line of
Hmm.
Republican virtue and constitutional order with rights,
Hmm.
but responsibilities woven throughout the thing. And that's what makes
Absolutely.
America special and distinct, is the way in which we approach freedom is not the ultimate good in and of itself, but a means to an
Hmm.
end. And therefore the end remains in sight, and the end is always more important um, than the means. And we've lost sight of that in our own day and age,
Yeah.
I would
And you
say,
mentioned
in a
you
really
mentioned
bad way.
virtue. Yeah, you mentioned virtue, and I think that's absolutely correct. Father Robert Sirico from Acton Institute, Sam Gregg, talk a lot about this. That is the free market is the best economic system to allow for human flourishing, and
Right.
it operates it operates most efficiently when it's run by virtuous people. And so the free market is not inherently evil, but if we have large numbers of people that operate within a quote free market system that are motivated solely by greed and by personal desire, then the system will eventually crumble. Now, the good part about it is the free market system is very resilient, right? And we see this throughout history where the more the government meddles, the worse off things become economically. We saw that with the creation of the Federal Reserve and then with the crash. So there's a there's a give and take in our free market society that as long as the majority of people that are interacting with it from a virtuous perspective, it continues to work and it continues to allow people to prosper. But our goal should be a virtuous society, which is created by good education system, the church, etc. You don't have to be a Christian to be virtuous. Although you and I would say that we think you should be a Christian because it's true and it's good and it's right. But we can have a virtuous society like de Tocqueville saw when he came to America, right? And looked around and saw, as Burke would say, all these little platoons and these people that took care of each other. That were all entrepreneurs, right? De Tocqueville noticed that Americans were very entrepreneurial, but motivated from a value creation, a value add, which is different than saying, I'm just going to make as much money as I can. Those are not the same things, right? And so we we need both sides of that coin. So let's go back to the rights piece. We kind of had an interesting conversation before we started recording about free speech and what does free speech actually mean, and where does our freedom start and stop. And there's some interesting takes on it from some different people that are very brilliant, smarter than us, and who are consistent in their principles and their values. But some would say that free speech, the current view, is that free speech means you can say anything at any time to any person, anywhere. The exception of, yelling fire in a crowded building, because that can cause physical harm to someone. But you can insult a person on the street, you can call them names. Look at the way we treat politicians that we disagree with now. We have riots in the streets that, with the pro-Palestinian movement right now, where there's, people on the anniversary of October 7th are singing the praises of Hezbollah in the streets of New York City, and talking about, Israeli genocide from the yeah, what's the I can't think of the phrase that they use. From the river to the sea, right?
Right.
Which basically just means the total extinction of Israel. And there's no consequences for any of this. But this is not how freedom of speech has been understood historically, even going back into British common law, which was the basis for a lot of the way we structured our constitution. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and that change and that the initial view?
Well, I saw a movie recently that's about what's it called? Denial? Something like that. It's a movie about a woman. She, and I think it's based on a true story. She was a professor, I think, of history, teaching on the Holocaust, and then another guy accuses her of basically libel, right? Or slander.
Hmm.
Slander is spoken, libel's printed. Yes, okay. Um,
Yeah.
so he accuses her of libel because she writes a book where she, says that his claims of Holocaust denial are bad scholarship and ludicrous and all that. And he launches a case against her in England. And the interesting dynamics of the case, from my perspective, are that in England, free speech works very differently. The burden of
Yeah.
proof is on the person making the claim. If you want to say somebody is, an idiot or a liar or whatever, you better be able to prove it, because if they want to press you for libel, they can. And it's on you as the one, who made the claim, who made the accusation in the first place, to be able to prove that what you said is true.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, the burden of proof would be on the person, who is being called an idiot, to
Hmm.
prove that, no, I'm not an idiot,
Did they
actually,
not
right?
do it?
Or you said I was guilty of this horrific crime. I'm going to prove that I did not actually do that horrific crime, and then turn around and sue you for damages and whatnot. So, like in America,
Hmm.
there's a way for you to get to the same outcome, right? But the burden of proof is placed differently, which leads to vastly different, outcomes in society and the way people govern and self-regulate their speech. So in America, there's very little incentive to not say the first thing that comes to your head. Um,
Hmm.
by design, that's really what makes us stand out as a First Amendment kind of country, with free speech as a fundamental founding principle that has its good points and it's got its bad points. You could say the best part of that is that the little guy who's speaking truth to power, he's protected, right,
Yep.
from the get-go.
Yeah. And what does that mean? Truth to power does not mean you can say, you know, a terrorist organization is I'm trying to think of the right way to make my point without being too extreme. I think we go back to we'll go back to Rockwell, right? So in the Four Freedoms, in his portrait of freedom of speech, it's a solitary man standing in a group of his peers at what appears to be a town meeting, maybe a county meeting of some kind, and he is giving his perspective and his opinion on the matters of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And he may be in disagreement with the people of the group, but he is not ranting, he's not raving, he's not calling names, he's not throwing bombs. He is giving a reasoned argument, but he is protected to give his argument,
Yeah.
even if the group disagrees with him, which is not the same as to walk in and say, my name is so and so, and if and I have this grievance with this specific politician that's on this town council, and this guy is moronic, and this guy is evil, and I think we should rebel. Like, it's not a you don't have a right to riot. You don't have a right to call people names. You don't have a right to going back to the pro-Palestinian stuff, to stand between Jewish students in their classroom and call them names and racial epithets and continue to insult them. Right? That's not a part of that was not the intention of the right for free speech. And a great example of this was the practice of dueling. Right? So this is not me making the case that dueling should be allowed today. I think it's I think it's a bad practice that dehumanizes and devalues human life. But if you were offended by the words that someone said to you, you could challenge them. And this was kind of a great check and balance, right? Because it kept people from making unfounded claims that they couldn't back up, and it kept people from refuting those claims if there wasn't actually grounds to refute them on. Hadley Arkes I think it's Arkes, maybe it's Arcus, I don't know how you pronounce his last name. I've only seen it, I've never heard it said. In his book, Mere Natural Law, talks about this version of the right to free speech. That it used to exclude fighting words. If you insulted someone on the street, you called them, a dirty so and so. They could challenge you. You did not have that right. You could actually sue them. You could take them to court and challenge them for damages. We've totally
words.
lost that today. Yeah, and so people have, well, I think the word you used originally was they have an impunity to their language.
Yeah.
Which allows them to insult and say whatever you want. Nobody, you go to a restaurant and somebody insults you or insults your wife. You can't go out to the parking lot and settle it. Right? Because if you do that, then you're going to get arrested and they're going to come after you with a civil lawsuit. And there's no way to adjudicate that wrong.
Aside from the fact they might pull a knife on you. Yeah.
Correct.
There's a whole
never bring a knife to a gunfight.
Whole system of honor, right? That went behind the dueling scheme, where you knew, like, if you were challenged to duel and you didn't show up, you couldn't really participate in polite society in the same way.
Right.
And if you showed up to a duel and, ambushed the guy, you'd be lynched. Yeah. And if so like there were all these expectations about how you would handle things peaceably and how you would handle them violently. And we've left that in the past a long time ago. But you make a compelling argument to bring back the dueling system, Bryce.
No. We should not bring that system back.
No, but I know you're bringing that up because that it served a function within that cultural system.
It was a mediating institution.
What's the closest thing that we have today? Someone's gonna put you on blast on Twitter.
Yeah, you're gonna get canceled, right?
Yeah,
which is just stupid. It's not meaningful because the people that follow that person are going to continue to follow it, and it's all posturing. There's no real consequence for your action.
Maybe we should bring back challenges to a Twitter duel. You show up, you have your fight over Twitter in limited characters. You get
back to the original 160 characters or less.
You get 5 rounds. Is it not limited anymore? It was 140 once upon a time. I don't know.
You're right. It was 140.
I don't use it. 5 rounds.
Sounds like you do.
The masses vote and see who won. No, that could be easily corrupted. Anyway, we don't have that kind of a what's the word? The escape valve.
Right.
Pressure release valve.
It's kind of yeah, this takes us back to the original comment of what do we have is freedom the ability to do what you want, or is it the responsibility to do what you ought, right? If it's the freedom to do what you want, then you can be insulting, you can be crass,
Right.
you can use terrible language on cable TV that a small child will could be flipping through and find, and we say that that's okay. There's you basically we're being ruled by the passions, right? We're not being ruled by the reason, or by the ethics rather. We're not being ruled by our chest. We're being ruled by our stomachs, as Lewis talks about in Abolition of Man. And so we we do what we want, as opposed to saying, as a member of this society, I ought to behave in a quote polite way, right? I'm not going to insult my neighbor. I'm not going to egg them on for no reason. I'm not going to be combative. I'm going to be civil because we all live within this, to quote George Costanza, we're living in a society, and that society requires this mutual understanding, this mutual assurance.
Yeah. Good quote
Hmm.
there.
Thank you. Thank you. From Abolition of Man to Seinfeld, you can expect it all here on the Way Forward podcast.
So I love that you brought it back to freedom and how we define freedom, what we mean by rights, and what exactly we think we're entitled to. The more pridefully we approach that question,
Mm-hmm.
the more we damage ourselves and everything we
Right.
touch. The more humbly we approach that question about what am I entitled to, the more we view it through the lens of responsibility and duty, like you mentioned. Thinking about
Yeah.
what ought I to use my abilities, my freedoms, my gifts for. And if I'm thinking in a right, just,
Yeah.
fair, peaceful kind of way, then what you end up with is a use of freedom that produces the kind of peace and prosperity and flourishing and community that you can get no other way.
Right. I think it goes back to I'm reminded rather of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right, where he says an unjust law is no law at all. I think the same thing is true for an abused right. If you abuse your right, then you basically you're not an abused right is not a right, right? I'm not sure the right way to turn that phrase, but I think the principle's there.
Yeah, that's reminding me of like a quote. Was it Teddy Roosevelt or something?
I don't know.
Sounds like a Teddy Roosevelt quote. But
Oh, that's pretty great.
yeah. I was in a bookstore yesterday and I overheard a couple guys talking about a book that they're reading that just was produced and actually was on the topic of freedom and how you define freedom. And it sounded like the author was pretty down on the idea of negative liberty. And maybe this is a good
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to acknowledge some of the critiques of the American founding and the classical approach to this. The idea being that if you only view freedom through the lens of the negative freedoms, right? The freedom to not be imposed upon by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys were saying, generally the people who gravitate to that end of the conversation are the same people that don't want to be interfered with as they are abusing the freedoms and the powers that they
Mm-hmm.
have, and by extension abusing the people around them.
Right.
Now, to be fair, I'm not overly optimistic. I don't have rose-colored glasses about human nature. I don't think that that's, an inconceivable thought that people would actually
Mm-hmm.
harm their fellow man and sin and abuse the powers
Yeah.
that they have. So I'm not saying that that couldn't happen or doesn't happen. But how would you respond to those guys in that bookstore, Bryce? Because I know you agree. We both have a pretty
Mm-hmm.
realistic approach to human nature. Um,
Yeah. I think a great example of this is greed within the marketplace. When you have someone who takes the free market system that we've created and abuses it for their own personal gain, as opposed to the American responsibility of being a creative, productive member of society and actually producing value and not taking advantage of people who don't understand the system, but rather actually bringing a product to market or encouraging a product to come to market through investment that will actually make life better for people. That is the right to that economic freedom, rightly understood. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah.
So I think it's there are absolutely abuses to these rights, and it's not just name calling. It's it has actual tangible harm. Like we can talk about the all of the family stuff, right? The families are incredibly broken today, and that's because we have created a right to marriage, and that right to marriage is based off of an emotional feeling of love, of the way we've in our American context very narrowly defined love,
Mm.
primarily in the form of eros, is with the idea of the four loves,
Yeah.
and we've redefined that right. Whereas, Katie Faust has a great book, Them Before Us. Highly encourage you to read it if you're not familiar with it. She talks about the right to adoption. And she says, no adult has the right to adoption. Single mom, like a single mom, a single dad, heterosexual couple, homosexual couple, none of them have the right to adoption. A child, on the other hand, has the right to be adopted. And those are very different things.
Mm.
Because if an adult has the right to adoption, then they can just take a child and claim them as their own.
Right.
Whereas a child, by the nature in which they come into being, by the union of a man and a woman, they have the right to parents. Like that's they're born with that and they're endowed with that inherent right. So we have
And to take
to
that a step further, they're entitled to that because that is the order by which God
correct.
created the world
Right.
and the life in it. So
Yeah. And even
it's
if you're
really
not
just a sense
even
that
if you're
there's
not
an order to these things that is the
correct.
optimal. It's the ideal.
Right. And even if you're not a Christian, you can still look at this and say, well, this is the order within nature, right? So we would say within nature, nature is God. I don't remember who it was. Was it somebody? Yeah, I don't remember if it was somebody at a Bible study recently. I don't think it was this morning when we were, but somebody recently was talking about, or maybe it was you. Maybe you were talking about this on Sunday. Um, no, I don't think so. Anyway, the idea that Scripture and the law within Scripture, you have the law of God creates the law of nature, and then you have the law of faith. Am I describing this right? Do you know what I'm
Yeah, that was
saying?
this morning.
Law of, that was this morning. Okay, walk us through those four pieces and how, because I think that it directly parallels objective truth in kind of our American experience.
Yeah, the basic idea, Scripture lays out the law of the Old Testament not as, the bad guy or the villain in the story from which mankind is being saved from, but rather as a tutor. Paul talks about the law as a tutor of sorts for people and for God's people as he's growing and shaping them in spiritual maturity, and they mature through the law, but it's not because the law is the ultimate goal, but rather the law is preparing them to be God's covenant people, and it's pointing them forward to Christ, the new Adam who will perfectly fulfill the law. And so we were talking this morning about how God provides the law of Moses as a tutor of sorts that prepares them for the law of the Spirit, that they're called to walk in the law of the Spirit, which is also, Paul
Yeah,
talks about the law of liberty, the law of love. And so these things all exceed the law of Moses, actually, right? To
right.
meet the standard of loving your neighbor is far higher than merely checking off the boxes of did you
Hmm.
give the 10%, did you leave that corner of your field for the scroungers, etc. To actually walk in love with God and your fellow man is a far higher bar. But that's exactly the one that Jesus
Right.
models and calls us to, and the one that the Spirit enables us to walk in. And so we were
Yeah,
talking
and
this
all
morning
of
about
that
that.
is yeah, and all of that is based off the order of nature, right? The first law that God created was the law of nature, and it all is based and builds from that origin. So when you're talking
And
about
we were talking about C.S. Lewis, who
you talk
said
about
that
rightly ordered,
I'll settle for,
yes,
making people into good pagans first, and then we can try to make them good Christians next. But so he saw a
right,
natural progression to it. If you can bring people more into line with
yeah,
the light of truth, the light of reason, there's an innate goodness to that, and it's not an either or of like, oh, you didn't have, God leading on the front edge of that, so therefore it's all a waste. He's saying, no, you
Yeah.
bring them into the light of God in one way or another, and you know what? Them being righteous pagans is a step of progress,
Hmm.
and then we can move on from there.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So, yeah, I think this goes back to the push and pull between the libertarian and the conservative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Libertarian says freedom to do what I want. Conservative says responsibility to do what I ought.
Right.
And that's going to be a natural and consistent tension within the Republican side of the aisle, because the libertarian is consumed with the self, and the conservative is focused on the society rather, which is interesting because you don't often think of conservatives with being concerned about society as a whole. Like, at least the folks on the left tend to brand conservatives as big business and individualistic and all of those things. But those individual liberties that lead to responsibility create a flourishing society. They create a healthy society that's balanced and well ordered.
Yes. Yeah, and so to bring it back to that question I posed to you, when people point out that um, people can harm their neighbor, absolutely, of course. But the key to this is not to become overly pessimistic about regular people and overly optimistic about the state, right? How about a
Right.
healthy realism across the board? Um,
Yeah.
and
Because what is the state made up of? It's made up of broken people.
people, and sometimes it attracts the very worst among us, historically
Absolutely.
speaking. But if you had a healthy realism across the board in terms of human nature and systems and power and the corrupting influence of power, I think we would agree that a better and more fruitful area to focus on is how do you lean into affirming this higher law of love and the innate dignity
Hmm.
of your neighbor. Um, because even then, we can talk all day long as conservatives about how I ought to live in this kind of way. I ought to do this. I ought to do that. That can
Hmm.
sound pretty legalistic if we reduce it to me operating in a vacuum. But that's not the real world, right? We're operating in the
Hmm.
context of relationships and people
Right.
all around us. And so the real point of it, and this also is, a focal point of our Bible study this morning. But law is the point. Love is the point.
Hmm.
Love is what we're always building towards. Love is the indicator that we're beginning to actually live into the promises of God and be the body of Christ. And even in a free society, for a free society to work well, the founding fathers knew you need a religious and moral people, because what we're really talking
Right.
about when you talk about free society is everyone's rights are being protected, which is just another way of saying people are being nice to each other, which is just another way of
Hmm.
saying nobody's infringing upon the dignity of their fellow man. And if we're not doing that, it's probably because we recognize the innate dignity of the people around us, and we see that which is worthy of our love and service.
Hmm. That's really good. That's really good. I think uh I think we should I think we should leave it there. I think we've walked through this pretty well. Hopefully the listener feels the same. I think I think I think today was a little tougher for us. We have both had a long week, and so
Feels that
if
way.
our arguments weren't as clear and concise and understandable this week, please forgive us. But as always, we're very thankful for you, the listener. We're thankful for our sponsor, Stand for Georgia Values.
Always.
You can find out more about them at gavalues.org. They're actually having an event coming up. Should be a link to RSVP in the show notes. They're going to be hosting a launch event for their pack on November 7th up in Waleska. It's a don't it's a you can't miss event. Can't miss event. It's going to be a wonderful time of fellowship and meeting like-minded individuals and liberty-minded folks and charting a path for the next couple of years, charting the way forward, if you will, for the next couple of years post-election season. So hope you'll join them there. Thank you for joining us here, and we'll talk to you soon. See you next time.
Thanks, Bryce.